I heard someone whisper at my husband's funeral that I would not last 6 months on my own, and I almost smiled because none of them knew the truth about me or the life I had quietly been protecting for years. I stood beside the polished casket with my hands folded neatly in front of me, accepting condolences from people who had not called in decades, people who suddenly remembered my name now that I was alone. Now that I was supposed to be fragile, I nodded when they told me to stay strong. I thanked them when they offered sympathy, and I noticed the way their eyes lingered just a little too long, not out of care, but out of quiet calculation, as if they were already measuring what would become of me. The house, the estate, everything they believed had suddenly been left without direction. My son Daniel stood a few feet away speaking in low tones with his wife Rachel, his hand resting lightly on her back. A gesture that once would have comforted me, but now felt distant, almost rehearsed. I watched as Rachel leaned in and whispered something that made him nod, and though I could not hear the words, I understood the rhythm of that kind of conversation. I had heard it before in different forms, softer versions wrapped in polite concern. I am just worried about her. It is too much for someone her age. Maybe she should consider something smaller, something easier to manage. They thought I did not notice how quickly those thoughts formed, how naturally they flowed once my husband was no longer there to stand beside me. I turned slightly and caught my reflection in the glass of a framed photograph across the room, a woman in black, silver hair carefully styled, posture straight, expression calm. I looked exactly like what they expected, a widow who had just lost everything, a woman people could pity without resistance, and for a brief moment, I allowed them to believe it. Because there was a certain advantage in being underestimated, Rachel approached me with a soft smile that did not quite reach her eyes and placed her hand gently on my arm, asking if I was holding up all right. Her voice warm, practiced, careful. I told her I was managing, that I appreciated everyone being here, and she nodded in that slow, sympathetic way people use when they believe they are witnessing the beginning of someone's decline. Daniel joined us a moment later, his expression serious, almost too serious, as if he had already stepped into a role he had been preparing for. He asked if I needed anything, if I had thought about what came next, and there it was, not even an hour after the service. The first quiet step toward a conversation they had likely already had without me. I told him we would talk later, that today was not the day for decisions, and he agreed, though I could see the slight hesitation in his eyes, the impatience he was trying to hide, as if time suddenly mattered more to him than it did to me, as if my life had already entered a phase that needed to be managed. I listened as more voices drifted around me, phrases like she will need help, and it is going to be hard for her now, and what will she do without him, each sentence carefully wrapped in concern but carrying the same quiet assumption, that I was alone, that I was unprepared, that I had been left with nothing but memories and a house too large for one person, and I let those assumptions settle in the room without correcting them. I did not mention the meetings I had attended with my husband over the past few years. I did not mention the documents I had reviewed, the decisions we had made together in calm, deliberate conversations late at night. I did not mention the number that existed quietly in a place none of them had access to, a number that could change every conversation they were already planning to have about me. Instead I stood there, composed and silent, listening to the future they were building in their minds, and thinking how different it would look once they realized that I was not the woman they thought they were dealing with. The next morning began with a quiet knock on the front door, softer than I expected, almost hesitant, as if whoever stood outside was unsure whether they were welcome or simply expected. I did not rush to answer it. Instead I finished pouring my coffee, set the cup carefully on the counter, and only then walked across the living room where sunlight had begun to stretch across the hardwood floor in long, pale lines. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there with Rachel just behind him, both dressed more casually than the day before, but carrying the same expressions they had worn at the funeral, concern mixed with something else, something more deliberate. He offered a small smile and asked if he could come in, as if this had not always been his home once. As if he needed permission now, I stepped aside without a word and let them enter, watching how Rachel's eyes moved again, briefly, across the room, not lingering on photographs or memories, but on space, on structure, on possibility. Daniel sat down at the dining table and rested his hands flat against the surface, a gesture that reminded me of his father, but without the same steadiness. Rachel remained standing for a moment before taking a seat beside him, her posture straight, composed, ready. I took my place across from them, my coffee untouched in front of me, and waited, because I knew they had not come to talk about grief. Daniel cleared his throat and began slowly, choosing his words with care, saying that he had been thinking a lot about the future, about what would be best for me, about how much responsibility a house like this could carry for one person. Rachel nodded gently as he spoke, adding that there were many wonderful communities nearby, places with support, with activities, with people my age, her voice smooth and reassuring, as if she was offering comfort rather than proposing a change. I listened without interrupting, my expression calm, my hands folded lightly in my lap, allowing them to continue building the conversation they had clearly rehearsed. Daniel mentioned maintenance costs, safety concerns, the distance from medical services, each point delivered like part of a well-structured argument, each one designed to sound reasonable, necessary even, and I could see the confidence growing in him. As he spoke, the belief that he was doing the right thing, that he was stepping into a role that required him to make decisions for me. Rachel leaned forward slightly and said that they had already looked at a few options, just to be prepared. Nothing was decided yet, of course, but it would not hurt to start considering a transition. The word transition lingered in the air between us, soft but heavy, and I noticed how neither of them used the word move, or leave, or sell. They wrapped everything in gentler language, as if the truth might sound too sharp if spoken directly. I let a few seconds pass before responding, just enough to make them wait, just enough to shift the rhythm of the conversation. Then I nodded slowly and said that I understood their concerns, that I appreciated them thinking ahead, and I saw the relief in Daniel's shoulders, the subtle exchange of a glance between him and Rachel, as if they had just passed the most difficult part, as if they believed I was already agreeing. I asked a simple question. What exactly did they have in mind? And Rachel answered quickly, outlining a plan that sounded far more developed than she had implied. Timelines, listings, consultations, all spoken in that same careful tone, and as she talked, I realized something important. They were not asking for my opinion, they were guiding me toward a decision they had already made. I nodded again, listening, letting them continue, and when she finished, I said that it sounded like something worth thinking about, nothing more, nothing less, and that was enough for them. Daniel smiled, a real smile this time, and said they could take it one step at a time. No pressure, just planning ahead. And I agreed, because there was no reason to resist yet, no reason to reveal anything. I watched them gather their things a short while later, satisfied, reassured, already speaking about next steps as they walked toward the door, and when it closed behind them, the house returned to silence once more, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but patient, as if everything was waiting for the right moment to unfold, and I stood there for a long second before turning back toward the study, knowing that whatever they believed had just begun. I had already been preparing for much longer than they could imagine. That afternoon I did not call anyone and I did not revisit the conversation in my head the way I might have years ago. Instead I moved through the house with a quiet awareness, noticing details that had always been there but had taken on a different meaning now. The way the sunlight reached the far wall of the living room at exactly 3 o'clock, the faint creak in the second stair from the top, the soft hum of the refrigerator that seemed louder in the absence of voices. Everything felt the same and yet nothing felt the same. Because for the first time I was looking at this house not as a home filled with memories, but as something others had already begun to measure and divide in their minds. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, running my fingers lightly across the row of neatly pressed shirts my husband had left behind, each one placed with the same care he brought to everything in his life. He had never been careless, not with his work, not with his family, and certainly not with what he left behind. I could still hear his voice in the quiet moments, not as a memory that faded, but as something steady and precise, the way he used to explain things when he wanted me to truly understand, not just listen. He had told me more than once that security was not something you talked about openly, it was something you built quietly and protected carefully. At the time I had nodded, trusting him without needing to know every detail. But now those words carried a different weight. I closed the closet and walked back toward the study, each step grounded, intentional, because I was no longer reacting to what Daniel and Rachel had said. I was observing the direction they were moving, and more importantly, the assumptions guiding them. They believed time was on their side, that I would eventually feel overwhelmed, that I would accept their version of help, and in doing so, give them exactly what they were positioning themselves to receive. I reached the desk and opened the drawer once more. Not hurriedly, not out of anxiety, but with the calm of someone who already understood what was inside. The documents were exactly as I had left them, organized, clear, precise, and as I reviewed them again, I noticed something I had not fully appreciated before. The The structure was not only protective, it was conditional, carefully designed so that control could not simply be transferred through assumption or pressure. There were steps, requirements, and safeguards that made it impossible for anyone to bypass the system without consequences. I traced a line of text slowly with my finger, reading it again, letting the meaning settle more deeply this time. And I felt a quiet certainty take hold, because I realized that what Daniel and Rachel were planning was not just premature, it was fundamentally flawed. They were preparing for a future that could not exist in the way they imagined, and they did not even know it. I closed the folder gently and returned it to its place, locking the drawer with the same measured motion as before. Then I stood and looked around the room, at the shelves filled with books, at the framed photographs that marked decades of life, at the chair where my husband used to sit and think in silence before making decisions that would shape everything that followed, and I understood that I was not alone in this, not in the way they believed, because everything he had built was still here, still working quietly beneath the surface, waiting, just as I was, for the moment when assumption would meet reality, and when it did, nothing they had planned would unfold the way they expected. The following day unfolded exactly as I expected. Not because I could predict every word Daniel and Rachel would say, but because I understood the pattern they were following, a pattern built on quiet urgency disguised as concern. By mid-morning my phone rang and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation but to set the pace. He asked how I was doing, his tone softer than the day before, more careful, as if he was easing into the next step. I told him I was fine, that I had slept well, that everything was in order. Simple answers, nothing that invited deeper questions. He paused for a moment before mentioning that he and Rachel had found a real estate agent who could stop by later in the week, just to take a look, just to give an idea of the market. Nothing formal, nothing binding, just information. The word information carried a familiar weight, the same kind of word people use when they have already decided what they want but need a way to introduce it gradually. I told him that could be arranged, that I did not mind someone stopping by, and I could almost hear the relief in his voice, the quiet confirmation that things were moving in the direction he expected. After the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to the kitchen. Finishing my coffee without distraction, the house remained still, unchanged, but I could feel the shift in momentum, subtle but undeniable. They had taken another step, and they believed I had followed. I spent the afternoon going through small routines, folding laundry, organizing a drawer that did not need organizing, walking through each room with the same calm attention I had carried the day before, not because I was preparing to leave, but because I was understanding the space in a different way, not as something that might be lost, but as something others were already claiming in their minds. Later that evening Rachel called, her voice warm and friendly, asking if I would be available on Thursday afternoon. She explained that the agent was highly recommended, someone who specialized in properties like mine, someone who could help make the transition smooth and simple. I agreed again, my tone steady, unhurried, giving nothing away. She thanked me, lingering just long enough to add that they were only trying to make things easier for me, that they wanted to take care of everything so I would not have to worry. I listened, acknowledging her words without challenging them, because there was no need to correct a narrative that was still unfolding. After the call ended, I walked once more into the study, the room that seemed to hold the only version of truth that mattered. I did not open the drawer this time, I did not need to. Instead, I stood by the window and looked out at the yard, the same yard where Daniel had once learned to ride a bicycle, where summer evenings had stretched long and unhurried, where nothing had ever been measured in terms of value or potential. And I thought about how easily those memories had been replaced by something else in his mind, something more practical, more immediate. I did not resent him for it, not in the way people might expect, because resentment would have required surprise, and there was no surprise left in any of this, only clarity. They were moving forward with a plan they believed was logical, necessary, even kind, and I was allowing it, not because I agreed, but because timing mattered, and revealing the truth too. Early would only disrupt what needed to happen next. I turned away from the window and walked out of the room, leaving everything exactly as it was, because for now, nothing needed to change, not yet. They were still building their version of the future, and I intended to let them finish. Thursday arrived without urgency, just as I expected, the kind of day that looked ordinary from the outside but carried a quiet shift beneath the surface. I woke early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, and moved through my morning routine with the same steady pace. Coffee, a light breakfast, the soft sound of the clock in the hallway marking each passing minute. Nothing felt rushed, nothing felt uncertain. and that calm was something Daniel and Rachel would not understand. By the time the doorbell rang in the early afternoon, I was already seated in the living room, hands resting gently on my lap, waiting, not for the agent, but for the next piece of their plan to reveal itself. When I opened the door, a man in his mid-40s stood there with a polite smile and a leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter, the agent Daniel had mentioned, his tone professional, practiced, the kind that made people feel reassured without asking too many questions. I invited him in and watched as he stepped inside, his eyes moving through the space with quiet efficiency, taking in the layout, the condition, the details that could be turned into numbers later. He complimented the structure, the natural light, the neighborhood, all the things that made the house appealing in a market sense, not a personal one, and I nodded politely, allowing him to speak, allowing him to measure, to assess, to calculate, because that was what he had been brought here to do. After a few minutes, Daniel and Rachel arrived, slightly out of breath, as if they did not want to miss anything important. Rachel greeted Mr. Carter with familiarity, confirming details they had clearly already discussed, and Daniel stood beside her, quieter this time, observing, listening, as if he was watching something become real. The conversation moved smoothly, almost too smoothly. Numbers were mentioned, ranges suggested, timelines outlined. Mr. Carter explained how quickly a property like this could attract interest, how the market was favorable, how a decision made now could be beneficial in the long term, each sentence carefully framed to support a conclusion that had already been forming before he stepped through the door. I remained seated, listening, not interrupting, not questioning, simply allowing the flow of information to continue, because the more they spoke, the clearer their intentions became. Rachel asked about staging, about minor updates that could increase value. Daniel nodded along, occasionally glancing at me, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps waiting for resistance, but I gave him none, and that seemed to strengthen his confidence, as if my silence was agreement, as if my calm was surrender. Eventually Mr. Carter turned to me directly, his expression respectful, asking how I felt about everything, whether I had any concerns, any preferences, any questions about the process. I met his gaze and offered a small, composed smile, telling him that I appreciated the information, that it was helpful to understand the possibilities, and that I would take some time to consider everything carefully. He nodded, satisfied with the answer, because it was the kind of answer that kept the door open, that suggested movement without commitment. After he left, Daniel and Rachel remained for a while longer, discussing next steps, speaking about scheduling, about preparing, about moving forward in a way that felt natural to them. I listened, occasionally acknowledging a point, but never leading the conversation, never revealing anything beyond what they already believed, and when they finally left, thanking me for being open-minded, for being practical, I closed the door behind them and stood in the quiet once more, the house unchanged, the air still, and I understood that they had now crossed from planning into action. They had begun to build something concrete based on assumptions they had never questioned, and that was exactly what needed to happen, because once a plan takes shape, it becomes far more difficult to abandon, and far more revealing when it begins to fail. I turned slowly and walked back toward the study, not to check the documents, but simply to be near the only part of this situation that had never depended on guesswork, and as I reached the doorway, I felt the same calm certainty settle in again, stronger this time, because everything was unfolding exactly as it should, not according to their expectations, but according to a structure they had not yet seen, and would not understand until it was far too late to change their course. The days that followed moved with a quiet rhythm that felt almost ordinary on the surface, but underneath, everything had shifted into motion. Daniel began calling more frequently, not long conversations, just brief check-ins, asking if I had thought more about the house, if I had any questions about the process, each call carrying a subtle expectation that I would be closer to a decision, and each time I answered in the same calm tone, telling him I was considering everything carefully, giving him just enough to keep his confidence steady. Rachel, on the other hand, became more direct. She started sending links, listings of smaller homes, retirement communities with polished photos and smiling residents, each message framed as helpful, thoughtful, supportive, but the pattern was clear. She was building a narrative, guiding me toward a conclusion she had already reached. I opened each message, looked at each photo, and then set the phone aside without responding immediately, not ignoring, just delaying, because timing mattered more than words. One afternoon she stopped by unannounced, her energy slightly different this time, less cautious, more assured, as if my lack of Resistance had convinced her that the outcome was inevitable. She walked through the living room slowly, commenting on how much work it must be to maintain everything, how overwhelming it could become, her voice light, almost sympathetic, but her eyes moved with intention, measuring again, always measuring. I listened, nodding occasionally, offering small acknowledgements, never pushing back, never agreeing fully, just enough to keep the conversation flowing without revealing anything beneath the surface. She eventually sat across from me and spoke more plainly, saying that the market would not stay this strong forever, that it would be smart to act while conditions were favorable, that waiting too long could mean missing an opportunity. I met her gaze and told her I understood, that it made sense to be practical, and I saw the flicker of satisfaction in her expression, the quiet confirmation that she believed I was aligning with her thinking. Later that evening Daniel called again. His tone lighter than before, almost relieved, mentioning that Rachel had told him our conversation went well, that he was glad I was being open-minded, that it would make everything easier moving forward. I told him that clarity often comes with time, that there was no need to rush, and he agreed, though I could hear the eagerness beneath his words, the desire to keep things moving, to reach a conclusion that had already taken shape in his mind. After the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat in silence for a long moment, not thinking about what they wanted, but about how far they had already committed themselves to this path. They were no longer testing an idea, they were reinforcing it, building it into something solid, something they believed would naturally lead to the outcome they expected. And that was the point where assumptions became dangerous, because once people invest themselves in a plan, they stop questioning its foundation, they stop looking for what they might have missed. I stood and walked slowly toward the study once more, not out of habit, but because it had become the only place where everything remained clear, where nothing depended on interpretation or persuasion. I did not open the drawer, I did not need to see the documents again, I already understood what they contained. Instead I stood by the desk and let the silence settle around me, feeling the quiet certainty that had been building since the day of the funeral, because I could see the shape of what was coming, not from their perspective, but from mine. They believed they were guiding me toward a decision, but in reality, they were moving themselves toward a moment they had not prepared for, and I intended to let them continue, step by step, until there was nothing left for them to rely on except the truth they had overlooked from the very beginning. By the end of the week their tone had changed in a way that would have been easy to miss if I had not been paying attention. The softness was still there, the careful phrasing, the polite concern, but underneath it there was a growing sense of certainty, as if they no longer saw this as a possibility but as something already in motion. Daniel called that Friday morning and spoke about timelines more directly, mentioning that the agent had availability to list within the next 2 weeks, that interest in the area was strong, that it would be wise not to delay. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish each thought, and when he paused, I responded in the same measured tone I had used all week, telling him that I agreed it was important to be thoughtful, that rushing decisions could lead to mistakes, and there was a brief silence on the other end of the line, not disagreement, but a slight adjustment, as if he was recalibrating his approach. Rachel followed later that afternoon with a visit, this time carrying a folder, neatly organized, with printed estimates, suggested listing prices, projected timelines, everything laid out in a way that made the future feel structured and inevitable. She placed the papers on the table and walked me through them step by step, explaining how each phase would work, how the transition could be smooth, how they would handle everything so I would not feel overwhelmed. Her confidence was no longer cautious, it was assured, built on the belief that I had already accepted the direction they were leading me toward. I sat across from her and listened, occasionally asking small questions, not to challenge, but to encourage her to explain more, to reveal how far they had already planned ahead. She spoke about temporary arrangements, about where I might stay during the process, about downsizing, about letting go of things that were no longer practical, and each word was carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable, supportive, even kind, but the meaning underneath was clear. They were not preparing options, they were preparing a transition, one that did not include this house as my home any longer. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for a response that would confirm everything she believed was already decided. I took a moment before speaking, not out of hesitation, but to control the pace, to ensure that what I said would guide the next step exactly where I wanted it to go. I told her that the plan was thorough, that I appreciated the effort they had put into organizing everything, and that I could see the logic behind it. Her expression softened further, relief settling in, as if the final piece had just fallen into place, I added that it might be helpful to move forward with the initial preparations, just to keep options open, nothing final, just progress, and that was all she needed to hear. She smiled, a genuine smile this time, and began talking about scheduling the next steps, about contacting the agent, about setting things in motion. I nodded, agreeing where necessary, allowing the conversation to move forward naturally, because this was the moment where their confidence would carry them fully into action, where they would begin committing to decisions that could not easily be undone. After she left, I gathered the papers she had brought and placed them neatly on the desk in the study, not because I needed them, but because they represented something important. Not information, but intention, a clear record of how far they were willing to go based on what they believed to be true. I stood there for a moment, looking at the folder, then at the closed drawer beneath it, and I felt a quiet sense of completion settle over me, because everything was now in place. They had built their plan, they had committed to it, and they had done so without ever questioning the foundation they stood on, and that was exactly what I had been waiting for. Not a confrontation, not a moment of conflict, but this, the point where certainty replaces caution, where assumptions become decisions, and where the truth, when revealed, would not just surprise them. It would dismantle everything they thought they understood about what comes next. On Monday morning, Daniel called again, but this time his voice carried a different kind of energy, not cautious, not tentative, but forward-moving, as if everything had already been decided and all that remained was execution. He told me the agent was ready to move ahead with listing preparations, that there were forms to review, appointments to schedule, small updates that could be handled quickly, and he asked if I would be available that afternoon to go over everything together. I paused just long enough to let the moment settle before answering, then I told him that would be fine, that it was probably time we all sat down and made things clear. There was a brief silence on the line, then a note of relief, almost gratitude, as if he had been waiting for that exact response. When they arrived later that day, Rachel carried the same folder as before, only now it was fuller, more structured, a reflection of how far they had already moved in their planning. Daniel followed closely behind her, his posture more confident than I had seen in weeks, as if stepping into a role he had fully accepted. We sat together in the living room, the papers spread neatly across the table, timelines outlined, signatures indicated, everything positioned as the natural next step. Rachel began walking through the documents, explaining each section with practiced ease. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding small comments about efficiency, about making the process smooth, about doing what was best for everyone. I listened without interruption, my expression calm, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, allowing them to complete their presentation, because what mattered was not what they were saying, but how certain they had become while saying it. When Rachel finished, she looked at me with quiet expectation, pen already placed near the first page, ready, waiting, and in that moment I could see it clearly. They were no longer asking, they were concluding. I let a few seconds pass, not out of hesitation, but to shift the weight of the room. Then I reached forward, not for the pen, but for the folder itself, closing it gently with a deliberate motion, the sound soft but final enough to break the rhythm they had established. Daniel's expression changed first, confusion replacing certainty. Rachel's followed, her posture tightening slightly as she tried to read the shift. I looked at both of them, steady, composed, and for the first time since the funeral, I allowed the direction of the conversation to change. I told them that I appreciated the effort they had put into preparing everything, that it was thorough, organized, and clearly well thought out, and I saw Daniel relax slightly, mistaking my tone for agreement. Then I continued, explaining that before any decision could be made, there was something important they needed to understand, something that had not been part of any of their discussions. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her expression attentive but guarded, Daniel's brow furrowed, uncertainty beginning to replace confidence. I stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, and walked toward the study, leaving them sitting in silence for a moment before they followed. When I reached the desk, I opened the drawer with the same steady motion I had used before, retrieved the folder inside, and placed it on the surface in front of them. Neither of them spoke, not yet, because something in the air had shifted in a way they could not immediately define. I opened the folder and turned it toward them, letting the first page rest in clear view, not explaining, not interpreting, simply allowing the structure, the terms, the signatures to speak for themselves. And as I watched their eyes move across the page, I saw the moment it began, the slow unraveling of everything they had built, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through something far more decisive, the quiet introduction of a reality they had never considered, and in that silence, I finally understood that the outcome had already been determined long before they ever began making plans for my future.